All right. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We are so excited to talk all things IEPs. So we know that this is a topic that is of great interest to a lot of our families, especially this time of year. Also, a hello to all of those are watching us right now through Facebook. We so appreciate you tuning in. And then we know there will be a lot of you that are watching this after the fact and just appreciate you all as well. I'm Casey, and I'll be your host again today on behalf of the Koolen-de Vries Syndrome Foundation. I am mom to Hudson 9, who was diagnosed with KDVS just 3.5 years ago. So our family has certainly been through our fair share of IEP meetings, and so I too am super excited about this conversation today. I'm honored to share the Zoom screen with Dan Morreale. Dan holds a master's in education degree and has been teaching for 7 years. He was voted lead teacher of the secondary therapeutic program. In addition, he has coached varsity wrestling for the last 7 years and was voted coach of the year in the Liberty District in 2018. Dan lives in Arlington, Virginia, and is a KDVS dad, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And Avery, his daughter, was actually featured in our 17 Things About a Cool Kid back in December on Facebook. And then another fun fact I wanted to mention is, Dan, I'm pretty sure about this, so check me if not, but I believe your wife also runs our KDVS merch store.
Yeah,
so
she helped set all that up and worked very closely, I think, with Ashley to make sure that got up and running. So
Dan is, I feel like, very well qualified to have this conversation with us today. So Dan, thank you so much for taking time to join us and welcome.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks I appreciate having me, and hopefully I can offer some advice and help make the process of IEPs a little more comforting.
Well, we so appreciate it. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we are meeting today on behalf of the KDVS Foundation and the Foundation's commitment to educate and increase awareness and promote research and support enrichment for families and individuals living with Koolen-de Vries. If you want to learn more about the foundation, please visit kdvsfoundation.org. So just a little bit of housekeeping I wanted to mention before we dive into the meat of our conversation. You all as families did an amazing job sending in questions. There were so many great questions. So we are going to do our absolute best to get through all of those. I just also wanted to be sure that we're asking questions of Dan that are well within his scope. And there are, I know, a lot of questions from families related to some of the clinical components of the diagnosis. And so I do want to make you aware if we don't get to the questions you have specifically today about your child or your loved one, please stay tuned because we will be hosting a virtual summit in July and are starting to release more information about that. And there's going to be everything from kind of the clinical components to research. So if we don't get to what you need today, I really believe we'll be covering it over the next month. So just keep that in mind. Also, this call is being recorded, so we will be sharing the link after the call just as soon as we can make it available. And then, of course, you can always go back and watch through our foundation page on Facebook. And then lastly, you'll notice on your screen, if you're joining us via Zoom, a Q&A button. So if time permits, and I don't know, I'm not making any promises because we got so many questions on the front end, but if time permits and you have a question for Dan, please feel free to hit that Q&A button at the bottom, and we've got Ashley keeping an eye on that for us, and if we can get to those questions, we certainly will. So with all of that being said, we're going to waste no more time and just jump right in because, like I said, we have a ton of questions for Dan. So Dan, the first thing I wanted to talk to you about is that, like I mentioned earlier, you're a cool dad. So can you tell us a little bit more about your cool teenager no, she's little, 5, right?
Yeah, she's 5. Yeah.
Can you tell us more about her and just your journey with KDVS as a parent?
Yeah, I mean, so our story kind of starts off like most of our families, where we were in the NICU for about 13 days, feeding being the primary issue. A couple other things came up. Fortunately, nothing too severe. And then she kind of missed some milestones, and we were talking to our doctor about it, and they kept telling us, well, she was a preemie, so let's wait till after a year and all that kind of stuff. And then a year hit, and we still kind of were missing stuff. So I was pressing a little bit because I saw some red flags that I thought maybe resembled some autism in regards to sensory and not speaking and that type of thing. So we got sent to, and we're in the Kaiser insurance, so it's like all in house. So the specialist we wanted to see was super backed up. It took like 3 months. So we finally went there. He ran a couple of tests like in person and was like, definitely not autism, but there is something going on. And his like area of emphasis is neurology and genetic type stuff. So he was like, well, on your way out, stop at the lab and have him draw some blood. And so they ran the tests, and then that's when we got our official. So she was about 18 months when we got the diagnoses. Um, from there, we dove right into early intervention, try to get on it as quickly as we could, as far as trying to help her improve. And I mean, since then, she's blossomed. She's in her third year of special ed preschool. She's starting to utter 2-word utterances. You know, she's trying to approximate a whole lot more. She rides around on her balance bike and stuff. So she's come a long way. She's doing great. So
That is awesome. Well, we appreciate you sharing. I think it's so special that we get to talk to you today about something that so many of our families are working through in this IEP process. But I think just, you being a KDVS dad yourself and having a child with special needs is just going to be so helpful to the conversation. So we're grateful for you, not like I said, sharing your time with us, but just also kind of that extra tie to all of us families that you have and being a part of our community as a parent. Regarding just teaching in general, we always like, before we dive into the meat of all this, just to learn a little bit more about you. What drew you to education and made you want to be a teacher?
So that's actually a really long story. So I'll do my best to kind of shorten it. But basically, I actually graduated undergrad with a business degree. And kind of just like most kids that right out of college, I was only being offered sales positions, and they weren't really for things that I felt I would want to sell or felt comfortable just cold calling and selling. So I got into coaching. My old high school coach, I reached out to him and he's like, hey, we need to fill a spot. So I got into coaching, and then they were bringing a child that they wanted a male for because of his severe behavior issues. So they were like, hey, do you want to do this? I was like, sure. And then we kind of went through our struggles and stuff. And his biggest thing was he couldn't do a combination lock. He was in 7th grade. And so I kept making him practice it. We were kind of half refused to give him a key lock because we knew he could do it. And eventually he did. And the joy of his scream in the hallway and like that unbridled enthusiasm, the emotion that sparked in me made me be like, this is what I need to do for the rest of my life. So from there, I enrolled in a master's program to pursue my degree in education. And I'm actually dual certified. I'm K through 6 for general education, and then K through 12 for special education.
That's awesome. That's great. Thank you for sharing. And then can you also tell us just some fun facts about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm actually originally from Rochester, New York, like right on Lake Ontario there, sandwiched dead center between Buffalo and Syracuse. My wife is also from Rochester, but we didn't meet until we were both in school in St. Louis, Missouri. So that's one of the things we always kind of joke around. It's kind of like movie-esque, where we had to move 800 miles away, even though we live, a few miles from each other.
Yep.
Wrestling is probably my number, besides my family and my children. Wrestling is probably my next biggest passion. I've been doing it since I was 6. And ironically, even though I'm from New York and live in Virginia, I'm an Oakland, or now Las Vegas Raider fan. So, just kind of all over the place,
Love it. And you told us that, which we posted to social media, that Batman, right, is your favorite superhero.
I feel as though Batman is one of the few superheroes that doesn't have any superhuman abilities. Everything he does is through him working hard and his belief in doing right. So I feel like that's why he's always been my favorite.
I love it. That's awesome. Well, thank you for sharing just some kind of personal things about you. Like I said, I think our families always enjoy kind of getting to know our speakers on a more personal level. And so now I'm just going to flip it over to you, Dan, if you don't mind, and let you share your screen. I know you've got just some things that you can kind of walk our families through, kind of just at a high level around just IEPs in general. And then after that, we'll just really start digging into some of those family questions.
Sounds good. Let me share my screen here. I'll just go desktop, make it easy. I have this set for my Microsoft Teams to share. It doesn't have its that. I have to add a permission real quick to Zoom. Should only take a second.
That's okay. Well, and I'd say I think I have it open if that's helpful. Do you want me to share it?
Yeah, because it looks like if when I change my preference, it wants me to restart. So
No problem.
sorry, I didn't even think to check. Our school district, when we were virtual, used Teams, so that's what I'm all set up for.
No problem at all. Can you see that, Dan?
Yep, that's perfect.
All right, let me just get in presentation mode. Are we still good?
Right now we just see the slides, but I mean we can keep it like this if,
Okay.
if you want. Just
All right, perfect. Yeah, let's just, and you just let me know when you want me to click ahead.
All right. So I call this IEPs 101. To be honest with all of our viewers, I'm not going to focus too much on the procedural and the process because I feel like that's not really where a ton of the questions are, and it's kind of secondary. I'm gonna primarily focus on, in general, what IEPs do for us, and this concept of accessing the curriculum. Because having been on both sides of the table, it's a difficult concept when you know what's right for your child, and the school kind of resists a little bit because the idea of accessing the curriculum is there, and like what really does that mean? So I'm gonna spend a lot of time talking about that to hopefully clarify what that means. Okay, you're good if you want to head to the next slide. So what does an IEP mean? Most places call it an individual educationalized plan. Some places call it a program. It really, tomato, tomato, just kind of depends on the school. But basically the idea is that you need some extra stuff in order to level the playing field. The simplest way that I like to think about this is like wearing a pair of glasses, right? Like if you can't see, the first thing somebody does is give you glasses so that you can see what everyone else sees. So that's really the idea behind an IEP. And that they're tailored to the individual student. I also think that that's very important. A lot of times as humans, we naturally want to compare and contrast and all that kind of stuff, but really your child is your child and what they need is what they need. And so the idea of an IEP is that let's make this educational system work for you. So that's always what you want to keep in mind going into the meeting. So the IDEA is an act. And I always chuckle whenever people call it the IDEA Act because you're really saying act twice. But basically, this was a federal law created a while ago. And as long as your child qualifies under one of these 13 eligibility categories, they are allowed to receive services through an IEP. One of the common misconceptions is how you are found eligible will dictate your services. That is not the case. All the eligibility category will do is open the door for you, right? So because a child with autism, with how wide of a spectrum that is, they might need intensive speech therapy. They might need none. They might need completely self-contained or like all special education students in a small group. They might not. So really all these categories do is open the door. The label, it's kind of important in the sense that you need one. You can always, some of my students even have up to 3. So they help in regards to approach from a teacher perspective, but in regards to what else is on the IEP, it's not necessarily what dictates it. It simply opens the door. So from there, we go into this term of accessing the curriculum. What does that mean? Basically, it means, can your child learn what they're being asked to learn, or do they need some help? If your child has an IEP, the answer to this is always going to be they're going to need some help. Where you kind of start to need to pay attention is where they're saying these needs are. Is the need in the expressive language, or like, are they able to advocate for themselves? Do they have struggle maintaining attention? Do they struggle with organization? Is it reading comprehension? Is it writing skills? So the main force behind your services is not necessarily your label, like I was talking about before, but rather what is impacting your child's ability to access the curriculum. And real quick, before we move forward, because I know speech is one thing that pretty much all of our children struggle with. So one of the difficult things as a parent is, you know how intensive that speech therapy has to be. And most of us probably have private therapy on the side as well. In a school's eyes, if your child is able to utilize the device they have in order to answer questions and get through their day, they might not feel as though they need speech therapy. Or if your child was in speech therapy in elementary school and as they get older, they're able to articulate more, but still have some struggles, but the teachers report that they're able to understand them and that type of thing, then in the school's eyes, your child is accessing the service. So one of the unfortunate things about this term is that, especially for families that may not have a lot of money or the best insurance to access outside services, really what the school is required to cover for you, and in their mind, it is, what does your child need to learn? And if they feel that a certain service is not needed for them to learn, then it may not be offered. That doesn't mean you can't get it, because there are a lot of ways to work through things and a lot of steps you can take. But if you think about it when you go to sit down at the table as what is going to impact my child from learning, and that's how you have conversations with teachers, I think you'll find more doors open, because they'll be looking at it like, oh, this does impact them from being able to learn math, or this does impact them from requesting to use the bathroom, which is something every child needs to do, that type of thing. So just kind of keep that in mind whenever you're starting to prepare for a meeting. Accommodations. So this may not have been the best title for the slide, but ultimately that's where I'm going with this. So when I'm writing an IEP and what we are taught, the general formula is you fill out what we call the presence levels performance, or PLAF, because teachers, we love our acronyms. And you identify, like our school requires us to have a strength in every category. I think some of that is to change the fact that sometimes, unfortunately, IEP meetings can always end up turning about where the student is weak. So I think the idea of plugging in strengths is that, at least talks about, even though they might struggle in this area, they do still have some skills in that area that are positive. But so ultimately, once that page is filled out, that's where your data should be. There should be, anecdotes are great, and sometimes when children are young, that's kind of all we have. My rule of thumb is I will put in there like the Woodcock-Johnson testing or any other updated evaluation testing in there, because that's really what should be driving my information. And then if I look at how the student's performing in class and it contradicts that test, I make sure to note that in the IEP with data saying student has performed at this rate on math tests, implying students' math calculation skills are X, Y, and Z, that type of thing. But once you identify a need, you have to have an accommodation or a goal or both. So again, this is where a lot of times as a parent, you can you start to puff your chest a little bit and get defensive, because maybe they identify processing speed as an area of weakness. So they say, okay, so we're going to do read aloud on tests, and we'll add wait time for answering, and we'll even add in like prep student for question coming, meaning if we're doing a class reading and I know I'm going to call on the student for question 3, I'll have my assistant or my special education teacher walk around and whisper to the student, hey, you're going to answer question 3. This gives them, they don't have to focus on 1 and 2 now, so they can focus on kind of the question that they're going to answer. So with those accommodations, you may not get service hours in the category of, sorry, my email is, of course, the teacher decided to do all these grades so I'm getting all these alerts that things are being graded. I apologize.
Hi, you're a teacher.
I was saying
goes,
that
right?
my email's not going to go off. Sorry about that.
Totally fine. It's okay.
So the idea being that processing speed need has been met through an accommodation. So you don't necessarily need service hours. So sometimes that's all you'll get, and then you won't get those extra hours because really that need has already been met. And that's where like glasses are a good example of my intervention for a student who can't see is let's get them glasses. Well, now they can see. They don't need special training or a skill set on how to use those glasses. So with that in mind, if the answer is yes, you just move on and you keep going. If an accommodation does not meet enough, then you'll have a goal. At least, again, and this is at my school district. I know all school districts are a little different, and then if you have a goal, it stands to reason you have to have service hours in order to meet that goal. So again, an example could be if you have a speech goal, then you're going to be required to need speech therapy because your gen ed teacher is not certified to teach you how to speak properly. So goals will always dictate your service hours and vice versa. So if you're going through your IEP and you're like, well, you gave me an attention organizational goal, and then at the service hours that's not addressed, you're well within your rights to request that there be service hours for that. Because how can you work towards a goal? And the way I think about it is, how can you work towards a goal if they're not assisting you with said goal? So that's like the general formula of an IEP. So I kind of go on a little bit on the next one to continue talking about accommodations a little bit, in the sense that sometimes you'll need both, right? So again, I'm highlighting speech because I know that's a concern kind of across the board. But so like my daughter has a speech device through the school, but because she's still so young and she's getting pretty good on it, but she's not necessarily good enough that she can fully access a curriculum. She also receives speech therapy. So sometimes you can have both an accommodation and a service. So don't think because you've added the accommodation that means you're not going to get the service hours. Because again, it ultimately boils down to goals. That is like, whenever I have students first year, like graduate people that come into the classroom that they want me to mentor, I always like, that's the one thing I harp on, is that if you have a need, it has to be answered somewhere. If that's in the accommodation, great. If it's not, then let's move forward and let's have a goal. And then once you see your goals, now you know how to address your service hours. So like, to me, and talking to a couple of my colleagues who aren't in special education, and you know, my wife, those are the things that we kind of wanted to highlight. The other thing I will say, regardless of the age of your child, make sure that your child knows the accommodations, because the IEP is useless if they don't know what's on it. And I know with younger students, that's kind of a weird concept because we don't expect them necessarily to advocate for themselves. But the younger that they can understand that this document is for them, then as they get older, the more they'll lean on that document and use it. I mean, I have students that come in as freshmen and they're like, man, I just needed extra time on this assignment. I didn't finish it. So now I'm not even going to turn it in because I'm going to get late. So what's the point? And I explained to them, like, well, your IEP says that when you talk to the teacher, you can get extended time. And they're like, wait, what does that mean? So knowing the accommodations and knowing that the accommodations are being implemented are huge, because they're there for a reason. And you'd be amazed at how often, if those accommodations are truly followed, how successful our children can be. A lot of times, some of the accommodations get overlooked, or you have a crazy pandemic year where you start virtual for 3/4 of the year, and then the last quarter you're in person. So you have to relook at those things. And so it's not even that teachers mean to, but sometimes those things kind of fall through the cracks. So the more familiar your child is with their own IEP, then the better advocate for themselves that they can be. So
that is a really great thought, because gosh, I'm even sitting here and my son's turning 10, just thinking about that. And you're right. Like, if I can find some of those things to simply break that down for him, especially as he gets older, and make sure he knows to ask for it, I'm sure that is really valuable. So no, I think that's a really helpful overview, because you know, it can just be so overwhelming to really know what to ask for and where to start. And so, and I think as we kind of answer these questions from our parents, we'll really kind of get into the meat of that. So I think from here, Dan, if you don't mind, we'll just kind of start jumping in and trying to crank through as many of these great questions as we can. So I do want to speak for a minute just to the rights. You know, one of the questions was, how can I learn my rights regarding an IEP, and anything you can share on how to request it, that first meeting, if you think your child needs one?
yeah, so I would say first and foremost, I mean, Google, as crazy as that sounds, Google's a great source. There are a lot of people out there who have broken stuff down that you can go and find. And maybe this is just my school or the schools that I have worked for, but we're required by law to at least offer you your rights at every IEP meeting. So I will say I actually have them in English, Spanish, and like 9 other languages, because living near DC, we're very diverse. So if any KDVS family like feel as though they haven't gotten a copy of their rights and want it, I have the exact like write up, so I can try to post that somewhere for everyone to access. And then if you need another language, just kind of reach out and through the grapevine. But I'd say like that's number one. It's very boring document and it's very thick. But if you wanted to know like right from the source, what are your rights? That's the ideal document to go to. I think it's like 74 to 84 pages, something like that. As far as like when to get an advocate, I think I always like to think of like don't think of an IEP meeting as going to war until like you need to, right? Because the idea is everyone at that table is there for your child. And until you know they're not, assume the best. That very first meeting when you know no one at the table, there's no case carrier, so to speak, like there's no person monitoring the IEP at that point. You can be a little bit more on edge because there's no relationship built there. But again, know what you want for your child. So when you go in, whether that's first grade, second grade, or pre-K, whatever the case may be, have read through the testing that you would have done to get to that step. Know what's on it. I mean, we literally brought, it was a journal done, I guess it would have been about 4 years ago, about speech and that type of thing that was written. It was published specifically about Koolen-de Vries children. I don't remember who wrote it. But so we literally brought that as well, just in case, because we were kind of warned that our district for preschool, the idea is that it's a language immersion classroom. So like you don't need speech therapy. And I was not going to leave that meeting without some. So I brought in all of my data because that's primarily what schools look at. You're going to hear kind of as we go through these questions, I'm going to use the word data a ton because everything a school does should be data driven. So if you have the data to support where your belief in what your child needs, that they can't access the curriculum is coming from, schools are 100% going to work with you. It's when you start giving them anecdotes about what happens at home or anecdotes about things you've seen or other kids that the school is going to kind of not entertain that thought. So going into the IEP, the first meeting, I don't know if you necessarily need an advocate. I think getting an advocate or someone to be there with you as support is if you leave that meeting without signing the document because you think the meeting went so far south, which again is a right of yours as a parent. If you don't like the meeting and you don't like the things went, don't sign the document because once you do, it's a legally binding contract. So don't sign it and ask to reconvene, ask for the next step ups in your district to be there. And that could potentially be when you ask for an advocate. And I would say as far as trying to find one, when you kind of start your search, find someone who's been doing it for a long time. Don't find, like sometimes startups are great and they're former special education teachers that got fed up with the system. And if that's the case, because they're in your budget, talk to them and you'll know right away if there's somebody who's kind of half-hearted into it or somebody who like this is their life. But typically advocates who've been doing it forever, that's their passion. They typically had a child that went through it or a cousin or they're somehow personally connected usually when they start. And so they're very passionate. So that's kind of the person you want to look for. And sometimes school districts will know most of the top advocates. So sometimes just by having that person's name there, that can change the entire demeanor of a meeting. So
that's interesting. That's really good advice. And speaking of just, so we talked a lot about IEPs. Can you briefly explain the difference between an IEP and a 504?
Yeah, so I like to think of a 504 as like a stepping stone. So kind of to continue on my glasses analogy, a 504 is like giving the kid the glasses to see if that helps right now that they can see. And if it does, that's where it'll stay because it's typically just interventions or accommodations. And then if those interventions and accommodations aren't working, you go to the next step of having someone in your life kind of helping prompt you, helping teaching you these goals, providing extra services. I mean, I think technically there's some hours associated with 504 plans, but they're pretty minimal and they're pretty intervention based as opposed to like working with collaboratively with a team to find a solution. Like I know I had a wrestler who had some pretty severe anxiety. So he had a 504 plan and they gave him what we call a flash pass, where if he was feeling anxious in class, he could flash that pass without having to say anything and walk out for like 10 minutes and then come back. And that worked. And he was able to kind of push through and he always had good grades. So he never needed that next step. But that's not always the case. And sometimes we realize these interventions aren't going to work. We need more. And that's typically when you'll go to an IEP.
What do you recommend, because I know you just talked about, not signing if you feel like it's not going the way it should. So what if you walk into the situation and you start to think through the goals and you just feel like the goals aren't challenging enough for your child? So kind of back to you saying, you know your child best and being your advocate. How do you push the team to create more challenging goals?
So I think some of that kind of depends on the age of the child. If they're older, like middle school through high school, typically, unfortunately, most students don't start attending their IEP till like ninth, 10th grade. I mean, I know I push my ninth graders big time to be a part of it because when they turn 18, they have to sign it. So I want them to have a few meetings under their belt. And some of that is obviously parental based. Some parents are like, absolutely not, I don't want my kid there. But I find having them there a lot of times, especially that first meeting they go to, when you start running through things, especially the accommodations, like, nah, I'll never use that. You could take that out. Or like, hey, is what's on here that you might need? So in regards to the goals, sometimes you can read a goal, read it to the kid, and they'll be like, not like because sometimes kids are more honest with their teachers than they are with their parents. I know that like is painful to hear, but it's less threatening, right? Like, because you don't really care if you let your teacher down, but you do care deeply if you let your parent down. So sometimes that goal might be hard enough, despite kind of what you see, because the school environment is very different than a home environment. Children are very comfortable at home. Like I know, we were talking when we were virtual, we were doing an OT session with my daughter, and our school OT was like, oh, she still has a hard time holding and kind of cutting the scissors through the paper. And we're like, no, she doesn't. And so like she picked it up and did it. And the OT was like, blew her mind. So sometimes children can just be more shy when they're at school than at home, which is something to keep in mind when you create the goals. So I'd say if your child is old enough, read them the goals because you should get emailed the IEP prior to the meeting. So review them, read them to your child if they're old enough, and see what they think because they'll be honest with you. They'll tell you, for the most part, they will be. The teenagers are teenagers, so sometimes that's not always true. For the younger ones, the way that I would approach that is if the ultimate goal you don't think is difficult enough, you can always try to compromise in the sense of meeting halfway, or a lot of times, again, it doesn't happen at the older age, but younger, because the way younger children work, we'll have what's called benchmarks for each goal, which are like short-term objectives to reach the final goal. So I feel as though the middle ground would be to have that goal be closer to where you're thinking and have these benchmarks be where the teacher is. Because if you go through a quarter or 2 quarters and they're not meeting those first benchmarks that the teacher laid out, you can always call another IEP meeting and adjust that. Like you, as a parent, anytime you think an IEP meeting is necessary, you can dive right in and you can call one. I always, whenever parents call me and ask for one, I ask if they want a formal IEP where I'm going to open a draft and make adjustments, or if they want the team to get together to talk about to see if that's what we need. So that goal situation would be one of those where, maybe your ultimate goal is that end of the year goal, but you have these short-term benchmarks that the teachers kind of think they'll be at. And then if they meet those benchmarks, then, kind of as a parent, you feel good. You're like, see, I told you we need a better goal, and if they don't, then you can go, okay, maybe there is something about being at school versus what I see at home. Let's meet as a team, and figure this out. So.
Yeah, perfect sense. That makes a lot of sense because you're right. And you might be seeing things at home that you aren't at school. And I love what you're saying too, just reminding parents to feel empowered to call those meetings, because I think sometimes it can be a little intimidating. But again, back to just the rights of the parents. And if you don't feel like it's going the way it should, just feeling empowered to call for one. I think that's a really good reminder. Yeah. Another question we had was, is there a way that parents can see examples of goals? And I know this is very individual, but is there a way for parents to see within their district kind of what goals should look like or might look like? Is there any resource for that?
Not necessarily. I know some schools kind of have some cookie cutter goals that they have. My school district does not. We can save our goals that we've written where, like, if we write one, we're like, oh, that's a really good goal. We can save that to our library. You can always ask, we call them case carriers. I don't know, like what other school districts, but that's like your go-to person. That's the person who writes the IEP and will typically be in class with your child. So you can always ask them if you could see some other goals that they've done, that type of thing. Again, Google will have some great stuff, but really a goal should really include ultimately 3 things. Obviously the name of the student, the date should be 1 year from the IEP meeting. And then it should be measurable. If it's not measurable, then what are you really pushing my child towards, right? So the ones that I know best are behavioral, just because that's my wheelhouse right now. So it'll be like when frustrated in class, student will utilize coping strategies in 4 out of 5 opportunities, right, like that to remain in class and complete work. And then I'll utilize teacher observation and class completion to show that that's what the student did. So like that's so tough because like really as a guy, I think about like suits and stuff, right? So if I go to buy a custom suit, I don't want a suit that I'm going to put on and just looks nice on me, right? Like I want it cut in the right places, let out in the right places so that it's the nicest thing I've ever had. And that's really how you should think about your goals, is that they should really be written for your child. So it's kind of tough. Like I'll give you another good example. Just the other day after we watched Dr. Koolen, we were kind of relaying some of the OT stuff to our OT, and she goes, "You can send me the video. It's great. I'll watch it. But honestly, I prefer to teach the client as opposed to the syndrome." Meaning like sometimes syndrome things can be, yes, there are a lot of them, but maybe they won't be. So if I hyper focus on this one category, I might miss something specific to your child. So I think a good approach is like just know your child, and part of that is being honest with yourself, right? Like it's hard to admit where our kids' struggles are. Like that's really hard, and you always immediately want to be defensive, like no, they can do that, or like no, this, that, right? But at the end of the day, if they could do all of that, they probably wouldn't have an IEP. And ultimately, if you're not honest about where their weaknesses are, you can never work to improve those. So I know that that's like a really hard gut check to do, especially. And it's funny because as a special education teacher, that's like one of the things I'm really good at, is identifying needs and working towards those. And then having sat on the other side of the table and, they're reading the results of like significantly low or below average, and you're like, you got to take one of those. They're not insulting my child. They're just telling me where my child is. Now that I know, what's the solution, right? So those goals are how they're going to get your child to improve in those categories. So you just want to make sure the key is you want it measurable, and you want to know how they're measuring it, because I mean, legally speaking, you can request to see the data when you get your progress reports home. Most people don't, but like if you see something and you're like, well, it seems like they're progressing on that, or like you're saying they are and I'm not seeing that at home, call up your like your case carrier should be your best friend. And that's kind of one of the things, like as you think about IEP meetings, there's a lot more to the meeting than that literal 45 minutes to an hour and a half that you're sitting at the table, right? So if you are in constant communication with your case carrier, you're talking, hey, I saw, you noted this, or they didn't do so. I was doing homework with them. I saw this, right? You're giving them the information from home. They can give it to you from school. So now both of you have the same picture of your child. So in a way, when you do that, you're really collaborating on how that document's going to be presented at the meeting, because you've been a part of it all along. And that also helps put some of the special education teachers' defenses down when you've been working with them, because when you're at the meeting and you're talking about things, it becomes that discussion you've now had 100 times. Whereas if you've been someone who's been quiet for 30 weeks of the school year, and then you sit down at the table and all of a sudden you want to disagree and that type of thing, the defenses go up, because the teachers, I'm going to tell you, teachers will immediately think, well, where have you been all year? Like, why didn't you say this 10 weeks ago if this is how you felt? They'd never say that out loud. At least they shouldn't. But they'll think it.
Right.
So the more collaboration you can have with that case carrier throughout the year, I think will ultimately lead to a document that you'll be very pleased with.
Yeah, that's a really great thought too. Just that, again, so much of life is just relationship based. So, to your point, just really trying to build a relationship with that team, and again, feeling empowered to call those meetings. And you're right. I mean, I do kind of feel like when I'm walking in that door that I sort of have to give myself a pep talk ahead of it. Again, like you said, it's just, this is about getting every possible thing I can for my son, and trying not to be defensive and just go in and be the advocate, and it is, you're right. It can be very hard and very emotional. So I think all those things you're saying, it's really good advice for parents. The other thoughts that came up, I'm just kind of looking, because again, we have so many good questions. What are your thoughts on trying to get the right balance between special education and being pulled out of class, and still getting that inclusion that we want for our children as well?
So at the younger level, I think that balance might be a little bit more difficult to find, because it's the literal pull-out services. As far as like the
Mm-hmm.
speech and OT and PT, if that's potentially what you get, those services just are what they are. They have to be pulled out. Sometimes like with kindergarten and stuff, OTs will push in to help with coloring and cutting and stuff. But for the most part, those services are pulled out because they are so tailored to your specific child. But as far as like math and reading and things like that, I am a firm believer, especially being a sports guy. Like Vince Lombardi gave a speech to the Packers once saying that we're going to strive for perfection, knowing full well we're not going to get it. But in shooting for perfection, we'll land on excellence. That's kind of my approach with school. Is like yes, you can absolutely overwhelm a child by trying to push them too much, right? So my number one suggestion is whatever their best subject is, if they're thriving in it and you think they're ready, push them in. Sometimes schools will be flexible with you and you can say, hey, like, can we try this without a meeting? Like, can we try keeping them in there for 4 or 5 reading lessons and then meet back again and talk and see like, hey, they knocked it out of the park, or like they seemed a little nervous the first couple, now they're starting to do well. Let's try another week and then talk. So always start with the wheelhouse subjects, right? Like if you know your kid hates math and that's the one you try to push them in integration first, it's probably not going to go well, right? But if they love books, they love using their imagination and reading and listening, that's probably where you want to try it. And again, one of the things to keep in mind with the IEP is the hours that are in the IEP are minimum, right? So those are bare minimum what you have to meet. So if your child is integrated for 7 hours a week or whatever it might be, if all of a sudden you're suggesting to the school, well, let's try 9. Technically, you don't even need a meeting for that. They can just do that because it's above and beyond. Because think about it, when they're in integrated settings, there are students that don't even have IEPs in that class, so they can go above and beyond the minimum hours. So I would say before you change the document, have that communication with your teachers and say, hey, can we try leaving them in, see how they do? Can we try maybe instead of having the reading teacher pull out, have the reading teacher push in, see how it goes? Because I always fear with too much pull out, we start, especially at the younger age, we start to worry about social, emotional impacts of that. So, because all we want to do is have our kids have like close friends, right? So if they're never in the room, it's hard to do that. So, kind of looking at the whole child and keeping that all around in mind, I think the best approach is to start slow, give it some time, and again, try it informally first before changing the document, because if you change it and it goes badly and you have to change it again, now you've had 2 extra IEP meetings. That's hard for you who's got to take off of work. Teachers got to get everyone lined up. But if you try it informally and it goes poorly and you revert back to the IEP, well, nothing's changed. Your kid knew they could come back, so they kind of had that safety net. But I would say, like, for high school kids, if they've been self-contained their whole life, again, start with that one subject and try that one subject integrated the whole year. Even if they do poorly, you always got summer school to like save, right? So try it, and if it goes really well, next year try 2, right? So that's the beauty of high school, is because you change classes, you can ultimately kind of do it one at a time, whereas the younger kids are in the one room all day. But you'll see it in your kid when they've hit that threshold. Like if you know your kid really well, you'll see that threshold. They'll come home, they may not be as happy about school. They may not be excited about going back, right? That might mean something either happened socially, or I'm getting pushed too hard and I'm burning out, right? So when you see that, again, that's where as a parent, take that proactive step. Call, hey, I've noticed, what have you seen? I've noticed this. Because a lot of times you'll notice the same things. And then that way you guys can, as a team, can work to find that balance. But so I'd say, start slow, start with a favorite subject, and work as a team, the team approach with it, because you see things they don't at home, and they see things you don't at school. So
yeah, that makes perfect sense. A couple other questions about specific IEPs, and then I have just a handful of questions just kind of on general education that we got from the parents. Can you just speak to resources available for extended school year, kind of what that means? And then anything you can speak to around resources for those that may be in private or homeschool situations, if you know that world at all.
Yeah, so I'll start with private and homeschool. I don't know a ton about that. Well, I actually ironically did one of my student teaching as a special education resource teacher at a private school. Um, it was like a legitimate private school. You had a test to get in. So really the students' needs that I met with were pretty minimal. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but usually they'll have something in like that private school setting. They'll have something to access. I don't know too much about the IEP writing there, or if like you transfer from a public school, if they just absorb it. As far as homeschool, I don't think that there's a ton of resources surrounding like school services, but there I do know we offer what's called homebound, which is like a
Okay.
temporary thing if your child has an injury or there's something traumatic happens, they can't come into school and they temporarily have to be home. We still have to educate that student. So the IEP will be modified to fit at home, but usually that means an adult will come and work X number of hours. Um, but as far as homeschooling, I'm not entirely certain about that. But
Yeah.
and then to speak towards extended school year, that is a very sensitive slash tricky subject. Um, the
Do
main
your best.
Yes, the main thing is, so think of extended school year as mandated school continued, which means if it's
Okay.
mandated, they have to be working towards a goal and they have to receive special education services. So if all you want is your child to be in school, you can always send them to summer school. I know that typically there's a cost there. There's applications and ways around that if you needed it, but I know that's kind of like the hiccup with that. But for an IEP purpose, when you do those goals, if one of them is not checked, critical life skill goal, typically you won't get extended school year. What is a critical life skill goal? That's a great question. um,
I'm so
that
glad you asked, Dan.
yeah, that is a so that honestly is going to be dependent on child's age and relationship with case carrier and parent. What I mean by
Okay.
that is you can stretch what a critical, there's no true definition of what a critical life skill goal is, right? Like if a kid is reading 3 grade levels below, I can say that's a critical life skill goal because they need to learn how to read things at their age in order to succeed in life, right? So think of life skill goals as things you have to have in order to live independently. That is what a life skill goal is. So um, I mean, a couple of years ago when my daughter wasn't making any noises or sounds, we used speech as that because you have to communicate with others. And with the motor function issues, sign language is very difficult for our children as well. So we've used speech as a critical life skill goal. I've literally used behavior where if a child can't manage their frustration and they curse out the teacher and walk out of the room, well, if they did that at a job, they'd be fired. So
Right.
but again, a lot of those conversations took place long before the meeting. Like if I think I'm going to recommend extended school year, it's a conversation I have with the family first, and we talk about what goal I'm specifically referring to, because once you check that box, the school is obligated to provide you special education services for the summer. The other thing that has to be considered is possible regression. So maybe you don't have critical life skill goals, but you're on the verge of reaching one of your goals you've been working towards all year. And your teachers have noticed that over winter break, typically 2 weeks, spring break, you come back and you're like, you need a couple more weeks now to get caught up to where you were. It stands to reason that if they had 6 to 8 weeks off, everything they've done can be gone. So if regression is something, again, if you have the data to show attendance dropped, schoolwork completion dropped, grades dropped, right, all correlated with breaks, then you can talk to your team about, I think regression is very real and I think we're going to lose the momentum we have. So let's pick a goal and let's recommend extended school year. So that's kind of like the way to think about it is like, is my child at risk of falling backwards and losing what they had for the year? Or
Mm-hmm.
is there a critical life skill goal in their IEP that needs to be addressed? Again, reading and writing are usually right at the top. At the younger ages, basic mathematics can be considered that because if you can't manage money, if you can't add and subtract appropriately, it's hard to get through life. So basically, if you work with your team and you genuinely feel passionate about it and you have the data to show this is why I believe it's a life skill, this should definitely be a conversation that's had. But again, don't think of it as going to war. Think of it as we're all here for what's best for my child. This is what I'm noticing. what are your thoughts? Because typically when it's presented that way by both the teacher and the parent, you are much more solution oriented as opposed to putting those self-defense cards up. So again, ESY is such a it's such a gray area. It's tough, but again, it's just kind of knowing where your child, where they are, and what next school year will look like if they don't have it.
Yeah, no, that's really good advice and a great way to think of it, because I do think that's one of those areas, like you said, it's just tricky to navigate and kind of know if it's something you should be asking for or qualified for. So one more question I want to ask you specific to IEPs is, do you have just any advice on how someone could overcome any negative stigmas or stereotypes associated with kids with IEPs? So if that's something they're kind of feeling in their school, what advice do you have?
So I think it's a lot easier. The advice that I'm going to suggest is a lot easier said than it actually is performed in real life. I think first and foremost is just keeping your child, like once it's age appropriate, keep them in the loop as to what that means. Because again, I'm just going to use my analogy of glasses, right? Like if somebody can't see, you put glasses on. Do kids get picked on for wearing glasses? Of course, there's always not nice people in your school, but as a whole, there's not a stigma against glasses, right? So in my mind, IEP should be perceived as the same thing, as it's just there to level the playing field, right? So I have students that are, and I have just about 13 kids on my caseload. So I have kids that are literally classes of 4 kids with 3 adults. And then I have students that are in our international baccalaureate program and will graduate with it over a 4.0 GPA and an IB diploma. So just because you have an IEP does not really say anything about you. Like, yeah, you have the term special education follow you, but it doesn't really say how you perform, right? Because nobody knows what you have it for except for you. Nobody knows, because with those things you can be extremely successful, right? That's the whole point of them. So I think the way to beat that stigma is just to really explain to your child and potentially your neighbors if you need to, that all that's there is to give somebody a crutch. They were born differently, right? Like, and different is okay. Different, and just keep preaching that. Like, it's not a bad thing to be different. It's harder to be different than it is to be like everyone else, and that's a good thing, right? Like, that's how I always pitch it. Like, just because like your difference is what makes you you, and that's there's nobody better than you. So that's kind of how I always try to explain it to my students. My daughter's not quite old enough yet for that spiel, but that's how I always pitch it to my students. Because as in high school, being popular that's what you want, right? So if people start hearing, oh, he's your special ed teacher or whatever, they might start chirping, and then the kids have to deal with that emotionally. But if they've been taught for years that, cool, man, like whatever, yeah, you're right, and I get better grades than you, you can always have a witty comeback, right? So I have more people in my life. Cool. Like that's what that means. I have more people that care about me in my life that want to see me succeed. Like, and it's hard at first. That'll be a weird concept, but I think if you keep drilling that in their head, that like, it's okay that you have one. It doesn't dictate your life. It doesn't mean, I've literally have kids graduate and go Ivy League with IEPs. So they don't necessarily dictate your future. They just mean that, you need a little bit extra so you can figure it out on your own and figure out your own habits and figure out what works for you. So, it's tough, but I think if they know that they have unwavering support, that goes a long way.
I totally agree. I think that is awesome. That's a great way to think about it. What do you think as far as, I'm just, a lot of the questions came in just with you being an educator, and especially a cool dad, as you think about some of the things that our kids may have the hardest time with. So a lot of people wrote in about math and learning money. Is there anything that you've just seen that works really, really well for children with special needs that you would maybe recommend to a family that they could either recommend at school or even use to work on at home? Any curriculums or tools you've seen?
Yeah, so curriculum and stuff, that's always tough, because sometimes if you recommend one that might contradict with the one the school uses, it can just cause hiccups. But I'd say in general, the number one thing for special education students is purely repetition. Like, the more they see it, the more, and like, start off structured repetition, and then you can kind of lean back, but ultimately make it personal and make it fun, right? So, you can Monopoly, play money, pay your children for chores, count it out. Like I'm at the cash register, I'm paying in cash. Okay, it's $5.25. I count my singles and have them hold it, put the quarter in their hand, have them pay it. And it's not going to sink in right away, but if you keep doing these things, they'll eventually catch on. Even if they don't know what a quarter is, they'll recognize, okay, the big one's worth this much, the little ones, like, so they'll rationalize it in their brain. But I think just constant exposure, if you pay them monopoly money for their chores and then have them pay you back for a prize, right? Like I want extra time on my tablet. That's going to cost you $310. Make them pay you. It's just kind of practice that's practical to them and makes it personal. And again, it's not going to, like, that's not going to be a cure-all. It's not going to happen overnight. But if you keep doing it and they keep practicing with it, eventually they will get it. And you could even you could even do that at school, right? Like you could talk to your teacher and be like, hey, we use a money system at home and especially if there's some slight behavior problems, like we've used it as reward for positive behavior. We catch them being good, that type of thing. We pay them. It's really come a long way with their money. And don't like say you should do it, but just say like, hey, if you wanted to try it, it's been really successful at home. Teachers might go, hey, you know what? Yeah, let's wing it. Let's see how it goes.
Yeah.
So
no, I love that. It's actually we just found Trolls Monopoly, and it's all ones. So Hudson loves it because we can play the game, but instead of having so many different types of money, he's learning to pay in that $1 bill. And then it's a fun family game for us to all play together. So I think you're right. Just that repetition, and then if we can make it fun, right, even better. Okay, so last question I wanted to ask you, and then we'll have to close because this time has gone so quickly. Is you obviously have, as a Kool Dad, lots of experience with preschool. So what advice can you give for those families who are in more of a preschool environment right now with their kids and not quite to elementary school and that type of an IEP environment? Anything you would say to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you start that process, if you've had early intervention, invite your case carrier from early intervention to that meeting, or invite your speech, like our case carrier couldn't make it, but our speech therapist came to the meeting with us because they've been working with your child for 1 to 3 years, depending on how early you got into early intervention, right? So they can speak clinically, they can speak philosophically to the teachers, speak their lingo about what they've done. More information, the better. Like I said, we told them about hospitalization, NICU stuff. We brought in doctor's reports. We brought in everything. So you can never give a teacher too much information, right? The more information they have, the better picture they can have, especially before they meet your child. And then again, it's just that constant communication. I mean, we probably email. So we had the first preschool teacher for 2 years. She literally came during the pandemic to give Avery a power wheel because we were so close with her. Like that's amazing. Yeah, we just talk to her every week. We email, like when we pick them up, we talk to them. And literally we'll talk about anything. We'll ask about her family, just to build that rapport. And then naturally, once somebody's more comfortable with you, they're going to naturally just give you more updates because it just feels right. So just especially with preschool, you typically will have a teacher for 2 or 3 years. So build that relationship, keep communication. And just, even if you're like, well, like we'll tell her, hey, we noticed, she hasn't gone to the bathroom in a few days. So we had to give her a tablet to help. It may get rough at school. Just want to give you a heads up, right? Like just things that you may not think the teacher want to know, they probably do. So, because the more you give them, it'll be reciprocated just kind of in the natural way that things flow. So, and especially at the preschool level, when you want your child to start learning and start those things, just flood the teacher with information and build that relationship. I think that'll be key.
I absolutely love that. We've talked a lot just with even some of the conversations we've had with some of the doctors and even just talking therapy, kind of the common theme has been the earlier that you can start the intervention process, the better, and just really advocating for those services early on. And I think what you just said is really, really great because you're right. If you do have the opportunity to build a relationship with someone in that preschool environment, that really starts to understand and know your child, and then you can bring them to that IEP meeting, even better. So that, I feel like that's just really, really great advice, Dan. So we have hit the 1 hour mark. It's hard to believe. We just so appreciate you taking time. I know this is the middle of a school day for you, and that you have taken an hour to just share with all of our families. So thank you. We really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Like, hopefully I was helpful. Hopefully I gave some good information. So And like I said, if anyone needs access to like those rights or anything like that, just reach out to you guys, and then you guys can email me, and I can forward you whatever I have to be helpful. So.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned before, we'll provide a link after the call. So for those of you that want to be able to go back and review it, you'll have that available to you, or can share it with your family members as well. Just keep in mind that, we are going to continue to have more events like these, and always would love to hear from you. So if there are topics that would be valuable to you and your families, please let us know. And then just stay tuned for more information about our virtual summit coming in July. We're going to have a lot of great speakers there, and just continue to share, and then also just build community among all of us as parents. So again, thank you so much. And if you want to learn more about KDVS, the foundation, the research, please visit kdvsfoundation.org. We look forward to connecting with all of you again soon. Thank you so much. And again, Dan, thank you so much. We appreciate you and your time today. Bye-bye.
Yeah, my pleasure.